That's interesting, because even doing the solid form, he's still got pretty much undisputable results. And I think it's still widely recognized as one of the more definitive studies documenting the toxicity of aspartame.
And part of that is because he did a lifetime study, which I also did. And most aspartame experiments cut off at most at 2 years. Many of the aspartame experiments were done for 1 day, a week, 3 weeks, and then they do this huge amount of studies that are very small, that are designed to, in my opinion, show no adverse effects, and then they claim that there's 200 studies that prove it's safe, which to me is suspect. Because all of the studies that were done by independent researchers showed adverse effects.
Yeah, that was, I forget the researcher who did that. I can see his face, but I can't remember his name. But he was, I think he was a psychiatrist, and he was an assistant professor at a university.
Is that Workman?
I think it was Workman, and it was very intriguing. There was like 90 studies, and it's like 80 or 90% of the studies that were funded by the industry showed no results, or negative results, and then the exact converse occurred for those that were independently funded.
And that brings you back to what you were saying about the FDA. In your book, Sweet Deception, you had that amazing interview with Dr. David Graham, and he's basically talking about how his superiors at the FDA believe that their clients are actually industry, whereas the FDA is tasked to protect the consumer. And in my opinion, it's like, say your father gives a lot of money to a university and you're a student there, and the administration influences the faculty to give you good grades. But not only that, you're allowed to set your own curriculum, set up your own projects, grade your own projects, and turn those grades into the teachers, and then they just turn them over to the administration and say, oh yeah, he did all this stuff, and we'll give him his diploma. It's just like total setup in favor of industry at the FDA.
Well, and not all industry or not all corporations are that evil, but unfortunately, perhaps review the history of this. I believe that NutraSweet, or aspartame, was initially brought to market by Monsanto and then changed hands several times. But is that correct?
It was actually G.D. Searle that was purchased by Monsanto in 1985.
Oh, so it's Searle, then Monsanto.
That's right.
I knew Monsanto had its evil hands in there in some way. So the point I want to make is that bringing it up to date now, even outside of the artificial sweetener industry, because that was really a pittance compared to what they've done now with really potentially destroying humanity and putting their influence in the control of virtually almost all the plants on the planet through their technology of genetically modified organisms. They're very clever. They have really essentially been able to infiltrate nearly 10 people into the federal government in very high regulatory areas, such as Vilsack is the head of the United States Department of Agriculture, and there's literally half a dozen. They have a former, their chief counsel is a former chief counsel, is now in the Supreme Court, Clarence Thomas, and half a dozen other people who have significant influence in regulatory decisions on this. So essentially what we have is a fascist state where there's this merger of the government and corporations, not all, but some, that essentially just rubber stamp these decisions. And, Monsanto started that nonsense 30 years ago, and, they've graduated to other even more pernicious approaches. But it is a challenge, and it doesn't mean they're going to win, but it does help to understand what the problem is, and that we can't rely on the federal government to protect us anymore. They're just not going to do it. It's too late. They've been infiltrated, and you have to understand that they are not there to protect you. They're there to protect and serve the corporate interests. So it's incumbent upon you to do your own research, be your own healthcare professional, and make these decisions yourself, and not to rely on the industry and certainly the media, the traditional media, to tell you the truth.
Yeah. I did some research on genetically modified foods as part of my research that I did to try to understand my experiment and the effects of the food that I gave them. and corn and soybeans are two of the most prevalently modified foods on the
Yeah, each of them over 90% in the United States.
Wow, I hadn't heard that statistic for corn, but
it's over 90%. And
yeah, it's scary. And then they use atrazine.
Cottonseed oil and then canola oil, too, are big ones.
Right.
So just last week, alfalfa, despite the fact that 95% or 92% of the current alfalfa crop is grown without herbicides. And the main benefit of doing genetically modified alfalfa is to put the Roundup resistance to them, and they don't even need it. They don't even need it. Oh.
And that's so scary because that can cross-pollinate into other crops.
Cross-pollinate.
Eventually destroy the organic food industry, or in terms of alfalfa and milk and things like that.
It's a big issue, and I was just did an interview yesterday with the head of the Organic Consumers Association, and we're going to be working with them to form a collaborative effort to help develop a resistance. And as we're recording this, there's a big turmoil going on in Egypt, which is something, on a similar basis where the bulk of the population just got fed up and said, we're not taking this anymore, and we can do the same thing in this country and exert our influence and demand our rights with respect to the protection of the future of our food supply.
That's great. I know in Europe they had a big to-do about genetically modified foods there, and then refused to allow them in their food supply. At least they might be sneaking them in now, though.
There's no formal restriction, but there's essentially a business decision, because the bulk of the population just chose not to do that, and they knew it was suicide, and they weren't able to manipulate the government to avoid them from labeling it. So they had to put a label on it. People wouldn't buy it, so they didn't have a choice. They weren't going to include it in there, otherwise they wouldn't be able to sell their products. So that's what we need to do in this country.
Yeah, that's what we need to do here. That may be the only way to do it too, because of as you mentioned, the stronghold in the government, Monsanto. In those positions of power, and it's overwhelming and frightening. But we are the consumers, and we have the power to spend our money on the products we want, as long as they don't destroy the organic food industry.
Yeah, and the other version of that too is that we can form local groups, and in our local communities, not in a national level, because they've got that corner covered, but locally we can make rules that require these providers of food supplies to do labeling and mandate that they do it in our community. So get enough of that, and that's going to change the whole system too. So we're going to hit them on two fronts. But let's get back to the NutraSweet and tie those up. I think one of the obvious questions now, and it's becoming, I don't know if you've done anything on this, but perhaps you can enlighten the listeners on it, is that the newest kid on the block is the cousin of NutraSweet, or aspartame, which is neotame, which is essentially a different molecule they've been able to patent as another artificial sweetener, but it's fairly similar to aspartame, and I wonder if you can comment on that.
Well, I'm familiar with it. I haven't done extensive studies on it in terms of researching about it and stuff, but what I'm wondering is whether or not it has a phenylalanine content, because I've been
it does. I think
that they don't have to label it. But PKU, if it's just put in factory foods willy-nilly, are going to start having reactions to it. So I just find that atrocious.
So I wouldn't be surprised if they've been able to bypass that labeling requirement. But I certainly have seen more shocking changes occur. But
yeah, that's one of the things about aspartame, is they can just label it as natural flavoring. Mm-hmm. And I don't understand why they don't have to put warnings to PKUs on those labels. But well, they don't care about our health in many other ways, so why should they? Sorry to be so skeptical.
No, it's not skeptical. It's just being honest, and that's the truth. And more than I don't know the history of how it was required to be put on there to begin with, because it is a relatively small amount, and most likely anyone with PKU would not really suffer serious consequences like they took large amounts of this, because it's such a tiny level. But it's not surprising that they would be able to exclude that from future products, at least part of labeling.
Yeah, I'm sorry I can't do commenting on the Attain other than what I've said already. I do believe they have permission to use foods without labeling. And
you haven't studied that in your animals, just restricted it to...
No, I was actually thinking about doing a Splenda study, but I'm afraid my days of doing rat studies are over.
Even though I wrote a book on Splenda, and the primary reason I did it because it was new to the market, and they were really trying to pull off a fast one on everyone and claim that it was this natural sweetener, when it actually was the furthest from a natural sweetener that could be. But from my review, it seems that aspartame is significantly more toxic than Splenda.
That's kind of what I came across too.
And if I was forced to have one or the other, I would definitely have Splenda. Not that either are good for you. They both probably have the similar side effects of this weight gain, which is really an essential core is why it causes so much damage. But they have their own intrinsic toxicities and should be avoided. I mean, they really should.
Yeah.
There's no question sugar is safer.
That's right. Like it can shrink the thymus gland by up to 40%, and that's part of your immune system. But when I was doing my research on aspartame to write my books, I would get ideas like, I wonder if it does this, and every single time I would find information substantiating my hypothesis. And all of the adverse effects that I observed in my rats, I was able to find instances in human beings having the same problems. So I didn't have that same kind of experience with Splenda, although Splenda is relatively new to the market, and it's possible that we're going to come across a lot more adverse effects as time goes on.
Well, many of these toxic exposures require a long number of years and pretty relatively chronic influences to make a difference. And this is what we're seeing with smoking. You don't have die from lung cancer for a few months or a few years of smoking. It takes a while.
And that's why I think a lot of those aspartame studies are ridiculous, because they, give you a huge amount of aspartame for one day, and then they say it doesn't cause diabetes.
Yeah.
And yet it's the chronic effects of like 20 years exposure, where the formaldehyde, say, builds up in the system, and the phenylalanine permanently changes your brain chemistry, and the aspartic acid causes holes in your brain. At some point, you start experiencing the adverse effects of those things, but not right away.
So the challenge, of course, is to take this information and use it practically. Certainly for yourself, anyone listening to this, I would hope that they are convinced enough not to be using them, but then you have your friends and family. And it's good. That's more of a challenge. It's difficult to preach at them. And I can remember attending a birthday party for my brother, and my little niece was dipping strawberries in NutraSweet. And it was just like, and I couldn't really say much because it would cause a family challenge, But,
I understand.
So even though I wrote a book on it, it's just, it's just kind of, you have to bite your tongue sometimes. But still we can have influence, so we can, certainly have discussions and seek to educate and inform others. But what other actions do you think we could do to help get aspartame actually